Elliot Graves sat in a dimly lit office, the weight of years pressing against his shoulders. The room smelled of aged wood and something faintly sterile, as if it had been scrubbed clean of history. The only source of light was a green-shaded banker's lamp, casting a sickly glow over the polished mahogany desk between him and the man who had summoned him here. The man was dressed in a pristine white suit, unblemished, immaculate. He did not belong in a room like this. He did not belong anywhere, really. His presence felt like a miscalculation in the fabric of reality, as if something ancient and unknowable had taken human form and slipped into the world unnoticed. Elliot studied him, trying to place him. There was something unsettling about the way he sat, too still, too composed. His hands, long and elegant, rested lightly on the desk. A smile played at the corner of his lips, polite but unreadable. Between them lay a contract, thick parchment with ink. The right price, the man said, his voice smooth as glass. I can take away all your suffering. No pain, no grief, no sadness. You will never feel heartbreak, regret, or loss again. Elliot exhaled, his fingers twitching against his knee. The words should have sounded absurd, but they didn't. Not here. Not in this room where the air itself felt charged with something beyond understanding. He had spent decades building an empire, decades enduring betrayal, failure, and the relentless misery of chasing happiness only to find it slipping through his fingers like sand. Wealth had come easily, but peace had never followed. The recent death of his wife had sealed it, an undeniable truth that no amount of money could change. Life at its core was suffering, and now here sat a man who promised otherwise. What's the catch? Elliot asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The stranger tilted his head slightly, considering the question. Then he smiled. No catch. The pain will be gone. Elliot stared at the contract. His mind screamed at him to hesitate, to analyze, to question. But his soul, his exhausted, battered soul, was already reaching for the pen. He picked it up, its weight unfamiliar in his grip. Then, with the flick of a pen, he signed his name. And just like that, the pain was gone. At first, it was everything he had ever wanted. Elliot woke the next morning feeling light. It was subtle at first, like stepping outside after a storm. The air washed clean. His body felt the same. His mind still carried the weight of memories, but something fundamental had shifted. The sharp, gnawing pain, the one that had burrowed into his chest for years, was gone. When he thought of his wife, there was no crushing sorrow, no desperate ache. He could remember her laugh, the way she used to roll her eyes at his terrible jokes, the way she smelled like vanilla and chamomile. But the memory was just that, an image, a fact. No grief. No wound reopening itself over and over again. He tested himself, prodding at his emotions like a doctor pressing on a healed scar. Nothing. For the first time in his life, he was free. At work, change became even clearer. In boardrooms filled with men who had once thrived on intimidation, Elliot became untouchable. Where others cracked under pressure, he remained unmoved. No frustration when a deal fell through. No anger when a rival undercut him. No stress. No hesi. Calculating logic. His employees noticed first. "You seem different, sir," one of them murmured after a tense meeting in which Elliot had dismantled a competitor's acquisition strategy with effortless precision. "Better," Elliot corrected, and the man nodded quickly, though he looked unconvinced. At the funeral of an old friend, he stood in a sea of mourners, watching as they wept and clung to one another. Their grief was raw, unfiltered. Elliot observed them with something like fascination, as if he were studying a foreign ritual. He knew he should feel something. He could even recall what grief used to feel like: the tightness in the throat, the heaviness in the chest, the hollow ache that made the world seem colorless. But now he simply stood there, hands in his pockets, nodding at condolences as if they were casual greetings. At night, he slept like a child. No tossing, no turning, no nightmares, no regret, no ghosts whispering in the dark. He had never felt so untouchable, so free. But freedom, he would soon learn, was just another word for emptiness. It started subtly. At first, Elliot barely noticed the shift. He still functioned, still moved through the world with effortless precision. His work remained impeccable, his decisions razor sharp, his days efficient and orderly. But then, small things began to lose their meaning. Laughter was the first to go. One evening, he sat in a high-rise restaurant, surrounded by colleagues. Someone told a joke. The table erupted in laughter, booming, genuine, infectious. Elliot smiled, but the act felt mechanical, as if he were mimicking something he no longer understood. The sound of laughter filled the room, but it did not reach him. It was as though he were watching people through glass, separated by an invisible barrier. Food was next. He ordered his usual, a dry-aged steak, perfectly cooked, plated with precision. He cut into it, brought a bite to his mouth, chewed. The texture was the salt, the fat. But the pleasure was gone. He finished the meal out of habit, not hunger. Music became noise. Sunsets lost their warmth. The scent of coffee in the morning, once comforting, became just another smell. One night, he sat alone in his penthouse, scrolling through old photos. His wife's face smiled up at him, frozen in time. He studied her, waiting for something: grief, love, nostalgia, anything at all. But the image was as meaningless as a stock photo in a magazine. Wrong. People began to notice. "You don't seem like yourself," a friend remarked over dinner, concern etched into his face. Elliot lifted his glass. "I feel better than I ever have." The friend hesitated, studying him. "Are you? Or are you just missing something?" Elliot shrugged. "What is there to miss?" He meant it. A few weeks later, he attended another funeral, this time for a distant relative. He stood in the back of the chapel, watching the waves of sorrow ripple through the crowd. Woman in front of him clutched a tissue, shaking with quiet sobs. He remembered crying once. He remembered the way it felt, the way grief had wrapped around his ribs like a vice, the way loss had tasted like salt on his lips. He touched his cheek, dry, always dry. A disturbing thought crept into his mind. Had he traded pain, or had he traded his humanity? He told himself it didn't matter. But deep down, something was missing. And for the first time, he felt the abs. Her at a gallery. She stood alone, gazing at a painting, a tempest of color and movement, brushstrokes colliding in chaos. She tilted her head, lost in it, lost in feeling. Elliot observed her for a moment, then stepped beside her. "It's just paint," he said. She turned, startled, then laughed. "No, it's everything." She was beautiful. Not in the way that stopped time, but in the way that made it worth keeping. Her presence was warm, like light spilling into a darkened room. They talked, smiled easily, laughed often, and when she looked at him, she really looked as if searching for something underneath the surface. They spent nights walking through the city, her hand sometimes brushing against his, testing boundaries he could not feel. She spoke of love like it was poetry, as if she had memorized every aching line. She believed in fate, in beauty, in the weight of a moment. And Elliot believed in nothing, but she loved him anyway. She whispered it one evening, curled against him on the couch, her fingers tracing circles on his palm. "I love you." He looked down at her, at the softness in her eyes, at the warmth pressing into his side. The words lingered between them, fragile, waiting to be returned. But there was nothing inside him to return. He opened his mouth, tried to summon the words, but they were hollow. He could no more say them than he could taste the air or cry for a loss he no longer felt. So he spoke the truth. "I feel nothing." She, as if struck. "What?" "I don't feel love. I don't feel anything." She sat up, staring at him, searching his face as if looking for a crack in the mask. But there was no mask. Just the empty, silent void where something human had once been. Her voice broke. "You're joking." He wasn't. And when he didn't speak, when he didn't rush to soften the words, her face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, real, warm, full of the unbearable weight of emotion he would never carry again. She stood. Her footsteps fading, door closing. He sat there in the silence, tried to miss her, tried to ache. But the absence of love was not heartbreak. It was nothing at all. Elliot knew something was wrong, but he could not name it. He continued his life as he always had, efficient, composed, untouched by the chaos of human emotion. His empire flourished. His decisions remained flawless. He was respected, admired, feared. But he was not alive. He went through the motions, eating, existing. But each action felt like a performance, a pantomime of a life he no longer inhabited. He could recall what joy had felt like, what sorrow had meant, but only as a scholar recalls history, distant facts, stripped of sensation. Then, one evening, he decided to test himself. He played a song, one that had once moved him to tears. The melody filled the room, stirring nothing. He walked to the window, staring at the city below. The skyline stretched endlessly, Nia, alive, but it may as well have been a painted backdrop. He read old love letters from his wife, ones that had once made his chest tighten, his breath catch. Now, they were just ink on paper. He tried to cry. He tried to force himself to feel the loss, the regret, the unbearable ache of a love now gone. Nothing came. For the first time since signing the contract, panic gripped him, not as fear, not as terror, but as a logical recognition of something missing. It was not the absence unsettled him. It was the absence of everything. Without pain, there was no joy. Without sorrow, there was no love. Without loss, there was no meaning. He had thought himself free, but in truth, he had stripped his life of all weight. He had become untouchable, but not indestructible, because destruction implies something breaking, and Elliot Graves had nothing left inside to break. And for the first time, he wanted it back. All of it. The grief, the sorrow, the anger, the crushing weight of loss, the raw, unbearable realness of being human. Because a life without pain was not freedom. It was a prison. Elliot searched for the stranger like a man drowning in air. He scoured every lead, every whisper of the impossible. He traced back the steps that had led him to that dimly lit office, only to find it gone, erased, as if it had never existed. He hunted down others who might have heard of a man in a pristine white suit, but they only looked at him with puzzled expressions. Heads, weeks passed, then months, until one day he found him. The stranger sat at a small cafe, sipping black coffee, immaculate as ever. The city roared around them, but he was still untouched, undisturbed, as if time bent around him. Elliot barely remembered crossing the street. One moment he saw him. The next he was there, standing at the table, hands trembling. The stranger looked up, smiling. "Ah, I was wondering when you'd come." Elliot pulled out the chair and sat. "I wa back." His voice was raw, desperate. All of it. The stranger exhaled slowly, as if this was the part of the conversation he had been dreading. "I warned you," he said, setting his cup down. "Pain isn't just suffering, it's the weight that gives life its depth. Without it, nothing means anything, but you already know that now." "Yes," Elliot hissed. "So take my money. Take everything I have, just give it back." The stranger tilted his head. "I don't sell pain, Elliot. I only buy it, heart pounded. Then take something else. My wealth, my power, my memories." The stranger shook his head. "Some things once lost can never be returned." Elliot's breath came fast, uneven. "That's not fair." The stranger leaned back in his chair, considering him. "Fair? What is fairness, if not the balance of gain and loss?" He lifted his cup again, took a slow sip. "You wanted freedom from pain. You got it. You never asked what that truly meant. Elliot gripped the edge of the table. Please, he whispered. But the stranger simply stood, smoothing his cuffs, buttoning his suit. Take care, Mr. Graves. Then he was gone. The cafe remained, the street bustled as before, but the chair across from Elliot sat empty. And for the first time, Elliot truly understood what it meant to lose something forever. Years passed. Seasons came and went, indifferent to the man who no longer felt their change. Elliot Graves remained. His empire still thrived, his wealth only grew, and was still spoken with reverence in boardrooms and whispered in exclusive circles. He was the same man he had always been, powerful, composed, untouchable. But he was only a shadow of what he once was. He lived in a house too large for one man, where every footstep echoed in empty rooms. His days were orderly, his nights silent. He no longer attended funerals, no longer entertained company. He had stopped pretending. There was no point. He sat in his study, a dring. Photographs he had once cherished. His wife's smile, frozen in time. The friends he had lost not to death, but to distance, to something they could not name but instinctively feared. He was still there in those photos. The man he used to be before he had stripped himself of the burden of feeling. He touched the glass frame, willing himself to feel something. Nothing came. Outside his window, the city pulsed with life. People rushing through rain, laughing under neon lights, fighting, crying, loving. He had been one of them once. He had known the sharp pang of longing, the sting of regret, the unrelenting grip of sorrow. He had known love. Now he knew only the void. He had spent his life chasing happiness, only to discover that happiness could not exist without its opposite. He had sought freedom, only to lock himself in a cage of his own making. He had everything: wealth, power, a perfect, pain-free existence. And yet, he would trade it all for a single moment of beautiful pain. Because now, in the hollow dusk of his life, he understood the one truth that had eluded him for so long. A life without pain was no life at all. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more meaningful stories.